and welcome to Dees Talk. I'm your host, Darius Alamuti, and my guests today are Christopher Ramsay and Simon Evill, who are the co-founders of Pelican AG. Pelican AG is an early-stage venture capital firm investing in the sustainable food system, which includes regenerative agriculture, smart supply chains, and empowering the sustainable consumer. Hi, guys, and thanks for joining me today.
Thanks for having us, Darius. Great to be here.
First of all, I'd like to just discuss a little bit about regenerative ag as a concept. How does it compare to mainstream or sustainable agriculture? And is this something that all farms can adopt, should they wish to?
I mean, start with an easy question.
Or is that too broad?
No, I think we could be here for many hours, so we'll try and keep it crisp. I mean, Simon, do you want to kick off and I'll come in around the edges?
Well, without wanting to get too philosophical too quickly,
Right.
Land is either degenerating or it's regenerating. So the concept of sustainability as it's applied to agriculture is a little bit misleading because the land is in a constant dynamic state. And generally speaking, in modern agriculture, we're either destroying the soil and reducing biodiversity and negatively affecting the ecology of the landscape, or we're improving it.
Yes. So I suppose in terms of adoption, which was part of the question, I mean, Cargill today announced, I think it's cutting 8,000 jobs, 5% of its workforce. There are many reasons that is the case. I mean, commodity prices being one of them. But I think it's also testament to the global shift that is going on across that farm to fork value chain. So whether it's the smallholder farmer who understands that the way that they've been farming might not have been as ecologically sound as they would have liked, i.e. they've watched the quality of their soil degrade over however many years. They've watched the water infiltration rates perhaps not being great at times like this in the year when we're experiencing severe flooding. And they may even have witnessed the quality of their produce decline with industrial methods, i.e. industrial inputs that generally speaking don't build soil and don't therefore produce a food that is able to benefit from having a healthy stock such that the root zone can swap the nutrients across the full spectrum that we've evolved to need that go into the food and produce a nutritious vegetable or a nutritious grass that our livestock would eat that we would then consume, that allow us to allow our bodily functions to thrive based on the full nutrient spectrum that only healthy soils can produce.
So would you say like an apple produced in one type of soil will have a totally different nutrient content to one in healthy soil?
I mean, that would be context specific, but there would be differences depending on the health, which is said in huge brackets, of that soil. But there's a perceived, I mean, there's a quote that's sort of often banded around at the moment, which is a supermarket store-bought carrot of 1939, so pre-war, has 12x more macronutrient in terms of profiling versus a store-bought carrot of today. And that is, yes, there are genetic reasons for that in terms of the type of carrots that are most commonly sold, for how long their shelf life is, what they look like in terms of aesthetics, and I suppose ease of quickness of growth. But the other reason is that our soils are literally more depleted than they were. And so the ability for that carrot to draw up the nutrients that it would have had have changed.
Yeah, because when you think of, say, the nutritional content of a carrot, I'm sure when you look it up online, it will say it's got this much carbohydrate, this much protein, this much, like an average or something, right? So maybe that needs to be looked into more. Like, not all carrots are created equal. You know, some.
No, I mean, we would argue that nutritional labeling, as it's, well-intentioned as it might be, is thoroughly misleading because of exactly that.
Right.
You've averaged things out, and the consumer is unaware that there could be quite drastic differences between the nutritional quality of one product and another.
Right.
We see this as a bit of a white horse, I say a white horse, a Trojan horse, into at least the consumer being better equipped to understand what is in their food. And once the consumer can really understand and compare, i.e. a regeneratively grown carrot or a ribeye that's been produced by a cow who has been allowed to, or has been pasture raised throughout its life and allowed to graze on a diverse sward of grasses, as opposed to the often very monocultural ryegrass fields that we see our livestock in the UK at least. If the consumer could see the incredible differences in not just omega-3 to 6 content, which is obviously sort of basically whether something's really good for you or perhaps not so good for you, but the full array of nutrients, many of which, you know, we may have taxonomized but might not understand entirely how they work together or how they bioassimilate into our bodies when we eat them. But then if a consumer can have access to these differences in nutrient profiles, all roads lead back to regeneration, or agroecological farming, however one might like to use the phrase.
So there's a direct link in between the quality of soil to the quality of the produce. And in terms of being able to head more in that direction of healthy soil, healthy food, how can we get away from a kind of universally average applied nutritional label to all carrots? And should it be like, well, our carrots have, should it be each farm starts to create their own nutritional label, and then that people start to educate the consumer about the supply chain and how actually there can be different types of carrots, and those are the low nutrition ones and these ones are higher? Is that where we should be heading, and increasing transparency on that side?
I mean, do you want to talk a bit about
Yeah.
Audacious? You go and I'll join in.
Yeah, well, that one. Well, we've invested in a company that is doing many of the things that you've just described. Right. So they're leveraging on the ground data, if you like. So they're taking samples of food from specific farms in specific supply chains, right, and analyzing those foods, and then they're benchmarking those against how those farms are managed and how that food is produced. And they're providing a service to brands that are already on the path towards regenerative agriculture or have already have been pioneering and adopted those practices for many years. And so they have a sense that their produce is of high quality, or they probably know that their produce is of high quality, but now they're looking to, on the marketing side, be able to translate that to their consumers.
Right. So the data side is probably a huge part of that. And I guess that would bring in AI and
exactly
as well, all of that.
And we're still pretty limited. You know, you think we've only taxonomized, they say 2% of what's in our soils. We think it's probably less. And even once you've taxonomized what's in the actual soil, let alone the food that's grown in the soil, you still need to understand how it interrelates with each other over the course of a day, a week, a season, a year. And so data is going to, until that data is understood and feeding back to us, we're not going to have a full understanding of how growing and therefore eating and eventually our health relate.
So you mean like in terms of the content of the soil, what sort of bacteria, like microorganisms, etc., all that stuff needs to be looked at because it's all playing a part in the ecosystem of the soil, which then feeds in with
but we do know some things.
Yeah.
So we do know that, for example, most agricultural soils that are used to grow crops have a fundamental imbalance, i.e. they're bacterially dominant, right, and they're lacking in fungal microbes. Now, natural soils and healthy soils have a balance between fungal and bacterial communities, and that plays an important function in making minerals available to plants, right, which is critical for their immune systems, but it's also critical for the nutritional quality that we derive from those crops. So in industrial farming, we tend to destroy those fungal microbes. Once you've destroyed them, you break a symbiotic relationship. The symbiotic relationship is that plants exudate sugars, as a pathway from photosynthesis. So they use CO2 to produce carbohydrates via photosynthesis, but they dump some of those sugars through their roots, which are porous, to bacteria. Those bacteria consume the sugars and exchange back to the plant vital nutrients that have been mined in the soil by fungal microbes.
Right.
So the fungal microbes will actually penetrate into the bedrock of the soil,
Right.
and will actually break up mineral particles and make them available at the root zone to plants via this interaction with bacteria.
Right. So it's a whole team effort. That's what I think is very misunderstood in the mainstream. That's something which people, especially when you have these farms that are using a lot of chemicals, they're like using fungicides, pesticides, etc. They're just trying to kill everything else to try to just leave whatever crop they're trying to grow, and they ignore all of that. Right? They're almost not taking that into account. But then, how much of this is known by the average farmer? Or
Well, some of it is very much experienced by the farmer. So there is a visible proxy. So compaction would be one example. And in this bad weather that we've got at the moment, huge amounts of pooling, so water that's just stuck, in puddles, trapped on the landscape, and it's not infiltrating. So those management practices that have used, for example, fungicides, have destroyed those biological communities, and the soil has basically collapsed on top of itself.
So by having those communities grow, it aerates the soil, creates more space in it, allows it to hold water better, things like that.
So one conceptualization which is very useful about what healthy soil is like is it's like a cake, a spongy cake.
Okay.
So it's full of air and it's full of porosity, and it has a maximal ability to absorb and infiltrate water and nutrients, and oxygen can infiltrate it. And healthy soil it's like flour,
Right.
is perhaps one way of thinking of it. It's both denuded of life, but it also can't absorb the water and it can't absorb the nutrients. In fact, those nutrients and those waters run off the landscape and go straight into our riparians and then out to sea.
And I mean, this is really touching upon like the core of why we're doing this, and why we think what we're doing is needs to have the drum banged as loudly as possible. If you increase soil organic matter, you make your soil healthier by better farming practices, which might be cover cropping and not ploughing, and reducing or completely getting rid of chemical inputs, introducing livestock, ideally having sensible rotations, the kind of main pillars of what might be termed regenerative farming. You're holding water in the landscape more. So carbon itself is hydrophilic, but also the structure of this more cake-like soil becomes more amenable to keeping water in it, whether it's the holes made by where earthworms have been, as an example, acting like holes in the cake, allowing water to flow through, or whether it's much more microscopic in terms of bacteria moving around and having pockets of air that water can come through. But the point is, it creates, it holds water in the landscape, and I think it's 25,000 litres per 1% uptick in soil organic matter per acre that can be held in the landscape as opposed to rushing off. And it creates a small water cycle. And a small water cycle is transpiration, is water coming off the land and obviously being forming in clouds usually, which also are white, bounce heat back, and eventually precipitate, cause rain. That could be half an acre. Equally, that could be continent scale.
Right.
And so what we're trying to show the average LP investor that might be looking at climate is that soil is this enormous lever to pull in terms of cooling the planet,
Right.
and in terms of restoring rain, restoring weather. And there's a sort of common misconception that rain really only likes areas that are so far from a coast, because most of the rain comes from the seas and eventually gets dropped on the land, and then you have sort of dry clouds coming further in. That's just simply not true. The Sahara was a thriving savanna at points, and there are wonderful archaeological findings showing very complex civilizations in the middle of the Sahara that survived off plentiful rainfall. And what we're, I suppose, trying to do is use that restoration of the water cycle piece combined with healthy soils being the only way to ultimately produce healthy food, which makes a healthy human, which is the solution to the health crisis in our eyes in terms of preventative medicine.
Sure.
And make that sort of a mainstay of how people think about solutions in terms of climate moving forward.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting because I do feel the average consumer is so cut off from all of these processes. They don't know where their food's coming from, what processes are involved in the agriculture, or how the food's being made, where it's coming from. They just go to a supermarket, it's all lined up on shelves and, you know, little packets. They're not thinking about any of that. And do you think that's one of the problems, that the average person has no idea about where it's coming, like how their food's being made, and then and also that these practices, or the traditional practices, and the damage they're causing, and then how that could then affect them and climate change and their nutrition and their sickness or health?
I think this is one of the great enlightenment periods for this, whether it's the farmer, whether it's the food corporate, whether it's anyone in the supply chain, whether it's the consumer or the retailer or the marketer, anyone in production. All of these areas are either being taken up by pressures from legislation or consumer demand, or they're being taken up by science, frankly, and creating these great opportunities for technology to come in and begin to show some light. But I would say on the consumer front at the moment, the UK is impressive in that, in terms of trying to become more agroecological, we're pioneering in terms of things like ELMS, the Environmental Land Management Scheme program that the Conservatives put into place, that Labour are now beginning to push through, or in terms of our woodland carbon code or our peatland carbon code. These are ever evolving, definitely not by any means fully fledged, correct, context suitable for wherever you are, but they are leading. And the UK perhaps doesn't make as much of a noise about regeneration as the US does to a consumer, where you will begin to see it on more products.
More package, like a label. Like, is there like a certification at the moment, or no?
Regenerative organic certification.
Yeah, in America they have, I think, a couple of upcoming.
Because I would imagine
Not
regenerative agriculture involves a bunch of things you need to implement. It's not just, and it's ever growing. I mean, that's why you guys are in the space. It's all different companies, all doing different, contributing to different aspects of it. And it's like,
it's got levels to it.
Yeah.
One analogy, it's like, if I've used this analogy before, I don't know whether people like it, but in mixed martial arts, when they first started the UFC, you might call that level 1, and maybe we're at level 3 or 4 now in terms of the sophistication of the athletes and the roundedness of their skill sets. Regenerative farming is not massively dissimilar, i.e. you can get to level 1, and there's a lot of farmers in the UK that are dabbling with level 1, but there's very few elite farmers that have been doing this for decades and have integrated an entirely holistic approach to how they manage not just the health of the farm from an ecological standpoint, but the health of their business.
Sure.
So regenerative farming at its best is much more abundant, much more profitable, and much more fun.
Yeah.
And just give in terms of keeping the analogy going, in terms of how it's not necessarily wedded to a particular method. It's almost in terms of Bruce Lee going about and collecting his preferred methods.
Yes, it's always context specific.
Right.
i.e.
So one thing that works in one environment, one climate.
Yes, the strategy, the overall goal is generally speaking the same. The overall goal is to improve the land and improve the health of the business and improve the lives of those that are working on the land. So in that sense, that's a pattern that crosses all cultures and all farmland. But then underneath that, the strategies and the tactics vary greatly because they have to be context specific. You might be on a farm in the hills. Owning a tractor is a preposterous idea. So it's a non-starter to head down the direction of, cover cropping or no-till farming because it's completely impractical. You've got rocky terrain, and you've got impossible weather systems that would come in and would just destroy a crop with one bad weather spell. So there are principles, but they are all applied differently in those different contexts.
Right.
Darius, just you were, in terms of the consumer and the sort of enlightenment of it, which sounds deeply patronising, so the word probably isn't appropriate. But what's interesting is how the consumer in sort of many revolutions haven't necessarily played the kind of pivotal part, but there are like various people in this space who think that the consumer is going to play a more of a leading role in this demand for more nutrient-dense produce that has been farmed in a more agroecological fashion. And I suppose what's interesting at the moment is the US have begun to really jump on this, and you will see regenerative organic certification in most supermarkets. In the UK, we've had Waitrose were the first supermarket to come out and say that all their meat and dairy is going to be regeneratively grown by 2030. It might be that they can come on quicker and include more in that product range, but they were the first to go, which we thought was quite late for a supermarket to really pin their flag to that mast. It was earlier this year. We've had Jeremy Clarkson obviously enamor the world, love or not quite love so much Clarkson as one might. He had a fairly coveted job as head of Top Gear for however many decades.
Yeah.
For him to sit around a fire with his farm manager and his farm team at the end of that first series and say, this is hands down the most satisfied that I've ever been, was pretty stirring. And with 15 million followers, it's created a groundswell that has managed to engage a younger audience, which has been part of this issue. And yes, in season 3, which finally ended up working with the Wild Farmed team and Andy Cato, who's one half of Groove Armada, who had been farming traditionally in France and then had discovered a more agroecological way of farming and produced some wonderful wheat doing it, and then came back here and prescribes a process to farmers to produce wheat, which he then buys at a premium and puts into the Wild Farm flour. They now have their own brand, sell through Waitrose, and they market to the consumer very well. What I'm trying to show is that there's this ever-increasing tide of consumer, I'd say, marketing education that's going on, which is very much only going to increase. And the final piece to this is someone like Chris Van Tullicum, who has a very famous children's channel. He's called Dr. Chris. He has a thing called Operation Ouch. He produces an enormous amount of television, very simply looking at ultra-processed foods and how they can convince the average person that they might be eating something fairly healthy in the form of perhaps a nutrient bar that you might have as a snack after breakfast, what perhaps high glyphosate content can do to you, what he calls empty calories, which are usually very soft, high calorific foods that are essentially nutritionally void, do to the human body and human brain over a period of time via ultra-processed formulation. And then sort of fairly subtly what is true in the opposite sense, where if one were to eat whole foods that have come from soils that have some health in them, how our bodily processes are able to thrive.
Yeah. I mean, that's a huge thing. I think labeling and there's this app, Yuka app, which you can scan any barcode and it will tell you, it will give a score of out of 100 how healthy it is. And it's quite surprising. I've been using it, and now there's a lot of foods which is even kind of marketing it on the packet as like some healthy thing. It's got mango in it, it's got this, whatever, but then it's got a really low score on that because of all the other stuff they put in. All the like stuff that keeps it together, gives it a good mouth feel, allows it to be transported and kept on shelves, etc.
It's very insidious.
Yeah.
There's
It's
most things are now have a health claim on them.
right.
Yeah, it's anyway. I think at some point the regulators have to they have to find some courage to actually draw some lines in the sand about how things are marketed to consumers.
Yeah.
This is a wormhole, though, Darius. I mean, emulsifiers as a sort of starter. Half of the research written about the most commonplace emulsifiers have been sponsored by Big Food and Ag to say that there is no conclusive evidence that emulsifiers can essentially clean the mucus lining of your gut,
Right.
for instance, which is obviously a vital part of the gut to be able to function properly. I mean, we probably don't want to get political, and I won't. But in the US at the moment, it is interesting to see how there are teams of people beginning to look at some of the ingredients that are allowed in the US that aren't often allowed in Europe. Often colorings, for instance, there's one called Yellow 5.
Is it more that way round? There's more allowed there, or there's more allowed
So
here?
the bad stuff is more prevalent, at least on the ingredient front, when it comes to things like colorants in America. If you compare the color of some Kellogg's cereal in the US to here they'll be using some fruit-derived coloring, whereas in America it might be purely chemical. So you'll actually be able to see that the blue is very, very blue out there, and the red is very, very red. But what's interesting is now the lid is being blown on what long-term exposure to those chemicals looks like, and whether they're neuroinhibitors or in any way inhibiting the growth of brain, spinal, physiological function.
Or
Hormones as
just
well.
downright cancerous.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Cancer and hormone disruption. I mean, I've been shocked at using that app to see how many things, like also toiletries as well, which, can also be advertised as, oh, this has got mint or, coconut. But then you look at what else it has in it. It focuses on one ingredient, but
Yes. As we're in a sense, we're ideologues in the sense that we're passionate about, a regenerative food system future, whatever that looks like. But we should all approach things with soberly. So that, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
yeah.
One piece of news that came out fairly recently, well, it's been going around for a long time, but it seems to be gaining traction on social media, is that these paper straws that we've been using as a replacement for plastic straws in an effort to reduce plastic consumption, they're all lined with PFAS,
Right.
which is a particularly volatile and insidious microplastic that ends up in our bodies and is endocrine disrupting, destroys testosterone in men, for example.
Right.
Or inhibits the production.
Is that the same as what they have in the Starbucks cups?
It's the same
coffee?
lining you get in coffee cups. It's
Yeah.
also the same thing you feel on printed receipts.
Ah, right. Yeah.
So yeah,
I've heard that. So printed receipts just by handling them.
yeah, don't get them. Don't touch them.
It seems like everything kills you. So it does. I was just like, I saw some Instagram video yesterday, and it was saying, don't use these plastic spatulas for your cooking. Don't use this pan. I'm gonna have to change my whole kitchen now.
Yeah,
Because everything seems to,
but to
creep in.
to extend the argument, in this rapidly changing food system that we're now sort of encountering, whereas, as Chris has pointed out, we're on the cusp of the consumer being fundamentally aware that the vast majority of the things that they eat and are exposed to are both addicting and are destroying their health over the long term and that of their families and children, and that farmers are beginning to adapt, in order to survive. They're beginning to take steps to reduce their dependence on synthetics and adopt some of these regenerative practices out of necessity. Farmers in the UK are adopting cover cropping and reducing tillage out of necessity so that they can actually get out into their fields in springtime and actually plant crops because it's become so difficult. With those things going on, the industry will, the existing industry will do what it can to survive. And so the large agricultural input companies are looking for the next glyphosate. They're looking for the next green fertilizer. And, you know, I just throw that out there because there's a lot to play for here, and there's also an awful lot still to lose. And what we're trying to do at Pelican Ag is make smart, intelligent bets on companies that are providing a viable pathway forward, rather than just another symptom-fighting strategy which maintains the status quo.
I mean, you mentioned that when people move to these practices, they end up having higher yields. They obviously are healthier themselves. They're producing more nutritious food. Is that not common known amongst the farmers? And if it is, then why isn't everyone doing it?
I guess it's not commonly known. You know, in a sense, it's that old. I don't know who came up with this phrase, but the future is already here. It's just not well distributed. Right. So at every level, regenerative agriculture suffers from a data problem, a believability problem. You know, from the common trope that one would hear from a farmer at an agricultural conference is, "Oh, I saw it work for Bill, but it won't work for me on my land." Right. And those perceptions are going to remain until a critical mass has been developed. And if you take the Pareto principle or sort of marketing gurus, that's probably somewhere around the 13-15% mark.
Right. And where are we now?
Probably, I don't know. It depends. I honestly don't know where we are. We read very sort of different sort of points of reference on this data. But you know, one aspect of regenerative farming in the US, which is beginning to gain traction, is more rotational forms of grazing.
Sure.
So introducing longer rest periods into grazing platforms. I read one agronomist who's quite famous in our sector thinks that about 5% of small family farms in the US are now managed in that fashion. Now, I don't know whether to believe that or where that data emanates from. We do know that organic is probably less than 2%.
Yeah, I think it's
wow.
insane. But and then just in terms of giving the maths on the latest carbon cowboy study, which was 1,000 farms over most states in the US.
I think it was smaller than 1,000, but it was the longest study. It was a 10-year study.
And it was looking at the amount of carbon sequestered if effective AMP grazing is put into place, which is adaptive multi-pasture grazing, which means that you're trying to mimic the predator-prey relationship of livestock, such that they intensively graze an area for a very short period of time, stamp and pee and shit, and then move on, often for a year, and it allows, I suppose, an optimum amount of grass to be eaten to the right level, whilst encouraging a root surge, and the figures are 12 tons of carbon per hectare.
Just to give some context to people that don't really know all this stuff, what you're speaking about is an integration. Is that just for meat production, or is that like integrating cattle into food crop production? So both in the same system, because from what I understand, at the moment it's completely separate. And the majority of farms, from what I've understood, are still factory farms. So it's very much cows just separated on massive lots that are just being fed soya, corn, things like that. And there's no grazing at all, even.
Well,
so what you're saying is not only grazing, which is, I assume, a small percentage, and now you're saying inside those grazing they should rotate. Is that correct? Or
I mean, there's a lot of generalities, and it's important to have generalities so that we all sort of know roughly what we're talking about.
Sure.
But there's also a lot of nuance that's left out of the conversation.
Yeah.
So if one takes the worst, most industrially produced beef that's, let's say, going into the McDonald's supply chain via these controlled animal feedlots in the Midwest that you're talking about, run by Cargill, etc., even that meat the animals would have spent 50 to 60% of their lives on small family farms. And some of those small family farms would have raised those animals with good husbandry and good management of the land, others perhaps not so.
What, and then they sell them into the
Exactly.
after once
So
they're of a certain age? Or?
Once they get to a certain weight and age, those heifers will go to the feedlot to be fattened up on that corn and soy, which is that surplus of crops that's being grown within the food supply chain, often underwritten by both subsidies and crop insurance. So we've sort of created this monster for ourselves.
Yeah.
And we're trapped into some of these industrialized systems. In the case of that meat production system, those highly intensive systems, they satisfy urban economics, i.e., the reason that those systems exist is because they need to slaughter animals at speed with economies of scale in order to deliver affordable meat to millions of people in city centres. So you can't really divorce, as soon as you start to talk about these things at a systems level, you can't really divorce the nature of food consumption and how cities aggregate food from rural areas from the controlled animal feedlots, from the grains and the soy that are used to fatten them up, which clearly makes them ill and is probably not good for us. But then you also can't separate the fact that it's actually a lot of rural farmers that are at the base of that supply chain as well.
So the demand is so high that it's necessary to maintain that system, because if you move to a regenerative way of doing it, it wouldn't create enough volume of meat.
Yeah, so let's say, it's partly, there's a geographical dimension to it. So in contrast to the American livestock sector, the UK one is in a far better state from a sustainable regenerative perspective. We don't have as many controlled animal feedlots. We do in our pig and our chicken and poultry and egg laying systems. They are definitely not sustainable and degenerative.
And that's most of them, right? That's the thing that, I think one huge thing I think of always is the image which people have of how a farm is, and the reality is so different as well. When even the imagery they probably use on the packaging as well, like for whether it's dairy and they have like a happy cow on it or something, whereas the reality is quite different. And some people might think, oh, that's just in the most intense or extreme cases. But from what I understand, correct me if I'm wrong, that is the majority. That's like over 80% of what, at least in the case of pigs and chickens.
Yeah, so I mean the typical livestock farm, and I'm referring to cattle and sheep predominantly. The typical livestock farm in the UK is probably less than 100 head of. Let's say it's a beef herd. It's probably less than 100. It's probably around 40 or 50, or maybe even less than that. Most of that meat is there's not that many abattoirs left. So those have become centralized, and the small family abattoirs have closed down. And if they're in a contract with a supermarket, then those animals get mixed with lots of other animals, and then they end up on the shelf. Right. And the consumer doesn't really know at this point, other than organic certification. There's very little relationship between how that food was grown and its husbandry and the consumer's awareness of that.
Right.
In the case of, let's say, our poultry production systems in the UK, those are highly intensive. We know that those are all, the animals are in confinement, and then the food is brought to them, and the food can come from around the world. Right. And that soy can potentially be coming from very badly managed or even land that's deforested in Brazil, although there are regulations that have tried to curb that. I think that the Brazilian government is actually unraveling a moratorium on deforested soy at the moment, which is going to cause quite a lot of controversy. Anyway, I digress. There's so many different sort of rabbit holes that you can go down into.
Well, because I think we should come back. It is an interesting one looking at the commodity supply chain. But if we go back to farm washing, if you think that 80% and the figures sort of 10% one way or the other, it might be more, of the UK buys the entirety of their food from 5 major supermarkets, and those supermarkets are being done at the moment for farm washing. So you buy a punnet of blueberries, it comes from a Tesco own brand blueberries. It comes from Wave Hill Farms or something, forgetting what the actual name is, that's being deemed as misleading at the moment, and they're having to shift that. But
where are they coming from, really?
they're coming from industrialized farms in Chile, Portugal, Spain, South Africa.
So they're being imported, but they're being shown as if they're some UK.
Well, whether it's UK or not, but definitely they're being the picture of a sort of bucolic British farm is what's being summoned, and that's across most fresh produce. You know, if you think that there's very limited fresh produce in a supermarket, it's really the outside section.
Sure.
And so we think how can we begin to shift a British food system, or indeed a global food system? And you think, you know, at the moment, Professor Tim Lang is the man to speak to you about food systems, and Professor Tim Benton. At the moment, 56% of UK diet is ultra processed. Obviously, that's an average. So if you were to go to some of the food deserts like Blackburn, Lancashire, for instance, where it's pretty difficult to find a whole food meal affordably, much easier to buy some fried chicken and chips. How can you begin to A, create access, B, shift a food culture, C, get perhaps a mum in charge of a single mum in charge of 5 kids who've got very accustomed to eating in a particular way to suddenly eat some peas and carrots is an enormous complex hurdle. People like Henry Dimbleby with their National Food Strategy and his most recent bill that's about to be published, which was delayed because of the farmer protests, lays out pretty good processes to get there. Ultimately, there will have to be some kind of legislation, taxation, in the same way as the smoking ban, which is highly contentious because it's really penalising low-income people in a far more aggressive way than others. And there are
because
solutions.
It's just so affordable, the highly processed frozen food stuff.
And it tastes so good.
Yeah.
You know, we've had teams of the best flavor scientists working on how to formulate these incredible salt, fat, sugar combinations.
Plus mouthfeel, all that stuff.
Yes, even like the sound of the Pringle pot or the Coca-Cola thing, it's sonic advertising. And they've been doing this, you know, snap, crackle and pop since the 60s. You know, everyone used to hold a bowl next to their thing. And sorry, I know you want to quite rightly jump in, but it's far more insidious than one can really even believe, not just in terms of taste, where the best scientists were involved, and some of those now Simon and I speak to are now being employed by companies that are beginning to look at nutritional profiling, something like Wild Farmed, and these scientists who've been working, I suppose, to create a sense of nutrition, but knowing that what they're promoting is nutritionally void, are now going to companies where they have been using sensible methods and are now able to start working. You know, flavors are obviously a very good predicator for nutrient density. So I mean, flavonoids and terpenes are things, aspects of food that are good for us, often also denote lots of flavor. But I suppose, I've lost my train of thought.
I was just going to add to your point about pervasiveness, but extend it from ultra-processed foods to whole foods in the industrial sort of supermarket setup. So there's a reason that all of the bacon looks exactly the same, and there's a reason that all the chickens look exactly the same. They're pretty much all the same weight when they're slaughtered. That's so that they can fit into machines that can process that at line speed.
Right.
So the industrial bacon slicer is calibrated to a certain size. That then produces a downstream consequence, which is that all of the pigs have to look the same, have to be the same breed, and they have to be managed in the same way. And that rewards the industrial production mechanistic system. So if you're raising a chicken in a controlled environment, which is what a shed is, you provide it with a calorie regime and a protein, fat, carbohydrate regime that gets it to a certain weight at a certain day to be slaughtered in order to meet the demands of us buying those things from the supermarket.
Right. Standardized, everything.
Everything's standardized.
Yeah.
The tomatoes that are grown in those Dutch warehouses, I mean, I hope I'm not overstepping the bounds, but I do understand still that it's quite common practice to spray a light fungicide on many of these vegetables post-harvest in order that there can be some guarantee that when that produce hits the shelf, it still looks fresh and is of a certain quality. And then, of course, then we're ingesting it. So, the system is entirely pervasive. If you're outside of that system and you're trying to carve a different path, so let's say you're a farmer trying to grow regeneratively and sell direct, well, you can do that, because if you can find a market for your delicious produce, then your cattle don't have to hit a certain weight by a certain date for you to have a functional business.
Sure.
But as soon as you're playing into large scale buyers, or you're trying to sell into the commodity market, you're certainly not going to be able to claim this premium on your exceptional produce which you've grown regeneratively. But in a sense, the fact that these hurdles and these obstacles look so insurmountable is not stopping the innovation that Chris and I are looking at and that we're backing.
Yeah.
And although everything is very, very challenging, there are still massive opportunities to create impact.
So you're still optimistic that these changes could happen in time? Because I've heard a fact, I think it was the United Nations said we only have about 60 harvests left, or there's some version of that quote, where how many harvests do we have left if we continue with current practices?
Well, no one knows.
No one knows, but it's obviously a one figure trying to encapsulate the whole world food production. But the point is that if we carry on as we are, soil will be depleted to the point that we won't be able to have food. And then there could be serious food crises even. And then we'll see some serious wars, etc., displacement of peoples, all that stuff coming in.
So, I mean, we're only ever 7 meals away from out and out revolution.
Yeah.
And if you look at the global food supply chain, and if you look at a kind of global map, there are 5 main points around the world where 90% of the world's commodity food travels through. And a lot of those areas are affected by issue, whether it's the Panama Canal shutting because the water's got too shallow, whether it's the issues around the Middle East stopping the Suez, whether it's any of the Black Sea, whether it's the Singaporean Straits. So from a global supply chain, it's this just-in-time-ness is very brittle, and that's beginning to be recognized. So the kind of onshoring of supply chains is something that's going to be exciting, and Simon and I, it's one of the many tailwinds that plays into the reason that we're doing this. But I think in terms of the legs of the regenerative food movement, and when we say regenerative food, we mean transitioning the entire farm to flush supply chain to be able to allow for maximum soil building and nutritious whole food to the end consumer, but done with a view that we are building soil to create small and large water cycles. We are creating habitat and biodiversity, and at the same time producing healthy food. Now, that's our top line. The reality of what we're actually seeing is there is a deluge of founder that has come in to fill these new scientific understanding points. So whether that's on farm and our understanding of how soil functions, or the data that needs to flow from farm to either the consumer or to the founder to be able to then monitor and improve, or whether it's understanding around supply chains and how to make those far more efficient. Often a supply chain has been referred to as a missing middle and not necessarily tampered with for decades. The wheat supply chain in America or the UK would be a good example that Wild Farmed are looking at. Or whether it's on the consumer end in terms of understanding what health actually looks like, which is a fairly blunt instrument at the moment, and it's getting more and more sophisticated. An example might be, no one could have predicted how quickly the adoption of alternative milks would have come into play. Sure. And as we're now beginning to see, some of the share prices don't necessarily reflect the health issues. So on the one hand, they may be able to claim a lower carbon footprint, which I think is probably debatable versus livestock that have been reared regeneratively, but certainly versus industrialized dairy is one of their big selling points, that they have less of a carbon footprint. But what they haven't been necessarily discussing as much as they should is the glycemic load and index of an oat milk product,
Right.
which essentially produces a carbohydrate that turns into a sugar that enters your bloodstream much quicker, often than raw cane sugar. And
Right.
The same
oats.
insulin response as Coca-Cola, apparently.
Really? What, from like, say, Oatly oat milk?
Without naming the brands, but
Right,
yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So-
I mean, I think you're right. And
Because they have like also oils and things in it like that aren't supposed to
Seed
be
oils.
that, not
Industrial seed oils.
that great for
yeah,
you.
Which to go back to Chris's point around nutritional profiling, there is a lot of epidemiological research that fats that are high in omega-6 relative to omega-3 trigger an inflammatory response and are linked to many chronic long-term health conditions. If you walk down the middle of the supermarket, I'm not just bashing at the alternative milks, but most things that we consume, the biscuits, the crisps, the cereals, all of the ultra-processed foods, they tend to be the three devils the three horsemen of the apocalypse: seed oils, flours, ultra-refined flours, and ultra-refined sugars.
Right. Yeah. I mean, that's why because I'm vegan and I don't have any dairy, so I was quite happy to see all these nut milks and etc. coming out, but then also realized that they're not the healthiest. So now just have a little nut milk machine at home that kind of make it fresh. Normally,
Nice.
you can just put in different types of nuts, and I've tried all different types actually, like even things like pistachio nut milk,
nice.
alternative ones that aren't like mainstream pecan nuts, and they all have different flavors, and they all act as milk, and still you can add them to coffee or whatever cereals, etc. So that could be, I mean, maybe that's a solution instead of, because obviously companies like Oatly must add those extras to allow it to be transported, etc., and stored. Is that why? Or obviously
and mouthfeel.
and mouthfeel, the creaminess, etc.
The creaminess comes from the fat.
Right.
There's the only other issue with them is if it's oat milk, particularly. Oats are often spray your oat crop with glyphosate at the very end of its life before harvest to dry it out, and that's when it's obviously at its most porous, and it retains a higher percentage of glyphosate, let's say, than some other crops. So there's a higher percentage of glyphosate that then ends up in the finished product. And glyphosate is, a neuroinhibitor and essentially an anti-bacterial.
If that's known, why is it allowed?
Well, I think
How are companies allowed to put things in food and sell them to us that it is proven do these kind of things to us, like which has all the knock-on effects on.
I mean, this may be a
the
bit
health side of
harsh,
this.
but I think that going back to good intentions, over the last 15 or 20 years, there's been a rising awareness amongst consumers around the ethicality or the lack of ethicality of a whole range of consumer products, and food has been at the center of that. And this has allowed companies to exploit that marketing opportunity, and they've seduced us, and they've played on our naivety. So I would like to encourage all people to be less naive and just to be more critical and look at the back of. The easiest thing to do is just to look at the back of the packaging and look at the ingredients.
Sure.
And if you can't pronounce the names of those things on the back of the ingredients label, it's probably not going to be doing you any good.
I guess that's
regardless of how well the product claims that it's doing something good for you and the planet.
So they might be fixing one problem, but they introduce some other issue.
Yes,
Every time
exactly.
that
And usually
happens
they're
a lot.
ahead of regulation, and so they can get away with it. And it's not necessarily, as you say, done on purpose each time. It is people trying to maximise profit and speak to their shareholders. So on the one hand, anyone listening to this, I would highly recommend that they read Ultra Processed People by Dr. Chris Van Tulleken, which was a New York Times bestseller, and it really lays out very clearly, I mean, for a sort of intelligent 12-year-old to understand, I think is the phrase that he uses. I'd also read Henry Dimbleby's Ravenous to get an idea as to what a series of solutions could look like to bring this entire food value chain into being more sustainable. And then I suppose the piece that we've touched on a few times here, which is something that I suppose Simon and I are keen to stress, is we're not just interested in trying to get every farmer to become regenerative. We know that's going to take time. What we're more interested in is showing people quite how much is already going on globally to push this space. So on the one hand, it's farmers. You then have the corporates in the middle, and those corporates have disproportionate power, whether it's the 4 big commodity traders or the 4 big meat packers in America, who've been zeroed in on quite a lot recently, or whether it's supermarkets. And Simon and I speak to many of these players, and some of them may spend longer justifying the scientific progress they've made in glyphosate, for instance, which we would obviously inherently disagree with. But the majority of them are genuinely trying to find ways to intelligently transition their supply chain at scale in a way that is going to be economic for them, but ultimately for the whole ecosystem. And that's exciting for us because on the one hand, it does mean that Simon and I will invest in companies that work directly with big ag and food, who have been the culprits of this frankly pollutive system and dangerous system. But on the flip side, they're the ones that are able to act quickest and at scale. So whether that's producing a biological input that would replace a fungicide or a herbicide, or whether it's trying to get them to understand quite what the negative consequences of their current farming practices or supply chains are.
Right.
And the movement is, I suppose, one litmus test we have in terms of being able to look at the enormity of the movement is the amount of companies that are trying to get venture funding, which implies that they also want to be venture profile in terms of the returns that they want to make, is enormous. And there aren't enough companies, investors that are focused solely on this space at the moment, at the early stage. We invest globally, but within the UK as well. And I'm one of the reasons for that, I think, is there's a lot of often very fair perceived wisdom around the difficulty of introducing new business to farmers, the idea you have a single growing cycle, the idea that lots of farms are laden in debt, the idea that they're multi-generational and have been acting in a certain way. But regardless of all of that, which is a system that will take a long time to change, there is, across this farm to fork value chain, a swathe of technology that's coming online to make things easier to transition, producing methods to do it, to show how to lend to farmers, for instance, in a way that is far more understanding of the amount of time that they might need to transition to a regenerative system than a normal agricultural lending bank might be geared up to do at the moment.
Right, because there's that valley of death, as they call it, where as they transition, there's a big capex going in, and maybe they reduce their income or their yield, but longer term it's up, but there's a short term dip, from what I understand.
Or there's the concern, there's a risk, there's a perception and perhaps a real risk that is what's going to happen.
Right.
I perhaps mildly disagree with you and say that, and we'll only know in time whether this is correct or not. I think that humans are highly innovative and adapt very, very quickly when they have their backs up against the wall. And I think the farming community is globally, it definitely has its backs against the wall. So,
and who's pushing them there?
So I will over-index on the pace at which regenerative farming practices get adopted globally, despite all of the doom and gloom, which is largely a sort of a city person's perception or an academic's perception of what's actually going on.
So if a lot of the practices are, I mean, like you mentioned tech that can help, I assume a lot of it is just education itself, like just changing the practices, and maybe the tech helps them to monitor or things like that. Like what kind of companies are you looking at that are helping this transition, and maybe go through some examples in your current portfolio?
Well,
I mean, so yeah, let's kind of let's do this together. we're very keen to stress that this is a whole value chain piece. It's not just on farm.
Right.
So
Okay.
we try and, from a portfolio construction perspective, make sure that we're completing a fairly holistic inclusion of that entire value chain.
So go through the value chain from the farm.
So from farm, we've invested into a company that lends to farmers that are transitioning.
Okay.
And that's US based, and they're one of the central existing hubs. They have a non-profit, which is very much a community building, best idea sharing piece. They've been around for a substantial amount of time, and they've kicked up an enormous stink. I say stink, a positive stink in the space. They then have a product that lends to these farmers, and it's been incredibly well received, and they're onto their second fund at the moment.
Right.
They're called Mad Capital,
Mad Capital.
they've been a keystone to the entire space in the US. We've also invested into a company that looks at soil measurement, but and then sells its technology to the laboratories in America. So it's
Right.
a B2B play, but it's Raman spectroscopy. It's the most sophisticated way of measuring what's actually going on in a soil at a particular moment that we have. In the middle, we've actually not invested.
So just to go back to that one, so that would help obviously farmers as they change their practices, start to be like, oh, my soil's getting healthier now.
Yes, we're providing visibility on things that up until fairly recently have just not been known
Right.
at
Yeah.
all.
Because that
So
seems to be the way to just get as much data as possible. And then I guess with the birth of AI, applying that as well could be quite useful. To
Exactly.
Be like,
So, one vision is that these technologies, such as the one that Chris has just referred to, are able to provide accurate decision support from how a farmer decides on their yearly crop plan to all of the management decisions that they make along that journey.
and then
how
how
they
that
apply.
translates into the
Yeah.
nutrition in the final food.
Yeah. But to unpack that slightly, soil biology is largely an unknown field. As in,
Right.
at the moment we have fairly low resolution data on the health of soils. So technologies that dramatically increase our visibility of soil health and then use AI trained against those data sets are in a very powerful position to provide farmers with decisions that will reduce some of those things that we were talking about. So the risk of a crop failing or the risk of a regenerative management plan creating a yield drag, you can minimize those effects. You can reduce the amount of capital that's required to transition by having intelligent data to inform decision making.
And what makes healthy soil? Is there, just to give a few ideas of markers, is it like the diversity of the microorganisms in it, or things like that, or what in?
Yes, it's about their diversity. It's not just about the biology. It's how the biology is interacting with the chemistry of the soil and the physical properties of the soil. So in a sense, those are the three dimensions. At the moment, sophisticated industrial farmers have a fairly good understanding of the physical properties of their soil, though certainly not perfect, but they have a good understanding of the chemistry of their soils.
Sure.
But biology is the missing part because the chemistry has to flow through biology in order for it to...
It's amazing they managed to create such a massive industry with such little knowledge of such a key input into their production.
Yeah.
That's interesting. So this soil testing allows you to see a lot more information about the soil. And like, what were the other companies you were saying?
I mean, it is just your point. It is amazing how the central ingredient to farming soil has been absolutely, completely ignored, but very much in favor of, big food and ag. I mean, if you look at the usage of glyphosate over the last 20 years, for instance, it's amazing how exponential it's become as soils have depleted and they've needed to rely on inputs more and more. So it's played into the system, and that's why it's such a big...
So the chemicals inputs are somewhat to add nutrients to the soil, which are supposedly then helping the plants to absorb them, and the other chemical inputs are to kill things they don't want in the soil.
Yeah, fungicides, pesticides.
Yeah, and do you want to get rid of both or change them into more helpful ones?
What we've been doing in industrial agriculture is we've been mining the soil. It's probably the best way of describing it.
Okay.
And then in order to keep getting yields off that land, we introduce exogenous synthetic inputs in order to drive those outcomes. And that might be analogous to, let's say, a bodybuilder taking drugs.
Sure.
So
they do see results.
It creates a short-term result, often a fairly superficial one, as in superficial in the sense that it's not as strongly correlated with strength, and it's definitely not correlated with long-term health.
See. Okay.
So when you go back to a natural system, it's a completely different paradigm. Your soil has a propensity to regenerate. So if one was to go back, I don't know, however many millions of years, 400 million years, right back to the beginning of terrestrial life on Earth, algae and formed a relationship with other bacteria on the edge of the ocean, and that was a sort of a rudimentary ancient form of lichen, and that was the first plant. And it began to mineralize the bedrock that it was on top of, and when it died, it deposited a tiny amount of soil.
Right.
Fast forward to now, the world has built huge quantities of soil that has detoxified our atmosphere and made it livable for creatures on planet Earth, going back however far. So nature has built a soil as a cornerstone of how land functions as an ecology, has created habitable life on the planet.
Right.
So it is literally the medium through which everything around us has been transmuted.
Yeah, which is fascinating. I mean, after reading Merlin Sheldrake's books and listening to his audiobook and watching his movie, that's all about mushrooms and lichens and their role on the planet, it's just kind of blown my mind as well to just hear how they are able to extract nutrients from rock effectively, and then so you start, and they can survive through outer space, through the vacuum of space, which was fascinating. Then I started to think, wow, if that, these kind of fungal mycelium networks, you start to think what implication that might have, that could have been sent here to create life here, because if it can make it through space and it can land and start to extract minerals, etc., from rock, and then form the basis of kind of symbiotic relationships with bacteria that I believe had photosynthetic qualities to them, and then form the first basis of plant life, with the lichens being the first roots, and then plant roots came a lot after. It was always in
that's right.
collaboration, which is just kind of fascinating, and I think most people don't even know that stuff.
Yeah, organic life emanates in the most difficult habitats, like the vents at the bottom of the ocean. Extreme temperatures, extreme pressure, no oxygen, but the right chemical compounds with an energy source can manifest into rudimentary organic life forms.
Yeah, and fungus is doing quite a lot now, I understand, even with like radioactive waste. So they've managed to find fungus that can eat that.
That's right.
And, so it seems like there's no limit to what fungus can do in terms of eating. I think even plastics and stuff, there's some fungus being developed in that area. I think there's a lot to explore with fungus, and would love to get some experts in that field on at some point to look into that.
And then there's that thinking that at the point when we discovered cooking with fire and our brains really began to develop and grow disproportionately to other primates, there's also a theory that we were following particular herds of wildebeest across the Serengeti plains or wherever we were, and there was a particular type of psilocybin mushroom that was growing out of the poo left behind by these particular herds.
Right.
I think that's probably pretty unprovable, but it's interesting that there's a theory that correlated with this uptick in brain growth.
So what, they ate the mushrooms and then they were like, let's play with fire?
or the two things happening at the same time,
Right.
being coincidental almost.
See.
So there's some people that
100%.
think,
I can see that. I mean, you see all the studies on psilocybin and the effect on the brain, and it's now that they've finally opened up again for scientists to use them in studies. You see some incredible results from people with PTSD and that were kind of resistant to other types of treatments, and how they've got through it, and how the use of mushrooms can light up all your brain and create new neural pathways and stuff. You can imagine that could have contributed towards a lot of our development early on.
It's hard not to see at every level that our evolution is, or our interaction with the fungal kingdom has been heavily influenced by their psychedelic properties.
Right.
I suppose neither of us being experts on psilocybin or mushrooms, but yeah, definitely interested in it. I think just on the whole value chain piece, just being interested in terms of like how the whole piece has exploded. One of the sections that we've been interested in is if supermarkets have played this disproportionate role in terms of feeding at least the UK, and obviously in America there are very few players feeding the US too. How genuine are any of their targets in terms of their nutritional targets for their customers over the course of the next year, 2, 3, 4 years, up to 2030? And is their scope 3 emissions and their supply chain and their biodiversity carbon footprint piece? And I think there's a range of how authentic supermarkets or any of the players in the middle perhaps are looking at this. But the most forward thinking of those players are making positive steps forward. So perhaps usually not enough, but that might be sponsoring a large number of pilot projects in the UK to look at regenerative farming by some of the big European food players, which are working with some of the more advanced farmers in the space and are producing enough cash to actually monitor and produce research that is going to be, I think, genuinely useful and be part of pushing this wave from early adopter into a larger amount of the food production industry or the supermarkets.
Wouldn't the farmers that adopt it start to pull away from the ones that don't, and then that itself would inspire them to?
It's already starting to sort of happen. Yeah, a lot of the leading regenerative farmers in the UK now have hybrid business models. So they maintain a relationship with their historic buyer, whether that was a grain merchant or whether that was selling a particular high-value item into the supermarkets. And then they've opened up essentially their own retail or B2B channels. And there's endless case studies of successful farmers. There are conferences that we go to where thousands of farmers are gathered to listen to, the absolute detail of how those farmers went on that journey and how they established their brand and how they built their customer base and how they managed their inventory, et cetera, et cetera. So
that's kind of vertical integration, which like going from the farm direct to the consumer. Was at the moment it's kind of
and it
big buyers in the middle.
Yeah,
and they're ending up with 2% of the finished product.
And it coincides with the development of what's called local food hubs, which is at the most basic level is where a group of farmers have loosely formed a sort of a cooperative.
Sure.
So they're pooling their produce in order to satisfy demand, often in a local area. Right. And this is quite easy. This will develop quite fast, we think, in the UK and Europe because of the density. The density of the population is quite evenly spread across a relatively small landscape. So any given farmer in the UK is probably, a lot of them are within 10 miles or 15 miles of a sort of a point of saturation, a customer base that can probably absorb everything that they produce on their farm.
Right. So how does that work? Is that like farmers market type stuff, or like a food hub? How would that work?
It's the evolution of the farmers market.
I see.
So it will have elements of Deliveroo and and Riverford
I see.
There'll be
Like
lots
Able
more.
and Cole, like
Yeah,
that kind of
the
stuff.
consumer will expect an online delivery component to it. They'll expect a degree of convenience that they're not getting at the farmers. People don't go to farmers markets to buy their groceries. They, generally speaking, go to the farmers market for an experience with the family, and they buy a few items. So this is more of a serious.
It's probably like a smaller percentage of their total, like supermarket or grocery spend for the week. Yeah, it's like a few specialist items, whatever.
But there've been waves of tech startups across Europe that have spotted this, let's say, this opportunity to decentralize the food system and challenge the supermarkets.
Right.
And we continue to see waves of innovation in that area. I think the truth of it is, particularly during COVID and post-COVID, a lot of people were forced to buy this way, online, at least temporarily, because the supermarket shelves were empty. And I think that's sort of broken the dominance of the supermarkets to a degree, at least psychologically in the minds of consumers. As in that real estate, if you like, those gigantic out-of-town supermarkets are no longer the dominant forces that they once were. Even with the supermarkets, you can see that they have shifted over the last 15 years towards smaller retail units. And as Chris was mentioning earlier, they're rebranding their own brand products with these sort of Waverley Farms colloquialisms, trying to make it all sort of cute. And so I think they do recognise that consumer preferences and habits are starting to change.
Can we put a brief pause on?
Sure.
I drank 15 pints of coconut water before
Let's have a little break.
Right?
That was a good hour and a bit anyway, yeah.
I suppose what we're keen to do is to show the LP community, LPs are investors into funds, that those that have put climate as a central focus within climate, soil building as a lever to, as I said at the very beginning of all of this, restore weather, create habitat, therefore biodiversity, and ultimately produce nutritious food. This is an incredibly strong lever for the greatest issues that humanity is facing, and yet it's not necessarily understood as a brilliantly investable asset class. And what we want to show is that the underlying companies that we have the pleasure of being able to get to know and understand a bit more fully are very much able to generate the venture return profiles that we as a very vanilla venture fund, and I say vanilla, I mean that in terms of the structure and the way we're set up, for the simple reason that we need to be able to attract the more institutional investors to this space in a way that they haven't previously necessarily prioritized. And so, I won't sit here and bang the drum on all of our investments, but if we were to pick maybe three that cover the value chain. We've spoken briefly about the lending platform. If we were to look in the middle, we could look at a company like FA Bio. I suppose this is still more on farm, but it was our first decision to work with a fungal microbe discovery platform that is replacing traditional chemical inputs. And it was the first time that we've decided to work with big ag. So it's working with the large players to replace products that they have for particular plants or crops and particular diseases in particular locations. And so in this instance, it might be a fungal microbe that has been taken from North Dakota to look at yellow wheat in rust. And it's an exciting business model from our perspective, in that each one of these product lines has a lifetime value of let's say 50 million, which we think is often fairly conservative, and they can produce between 5 and 15 of these a year. We modeled
5 and 15 what?
Of separate products.
Okay, so they produce products which farmers would buy to spray on their crops that would replace existing chemical
They would be sold by big ag to farmers as more efficient, price parity or cheaper.
Right.
But the point is, we're not trying to...
So they're selling to big ag.
Exactly.
So these are because your companies are quite early stage startups, right? Would you say like
pre-seed, seed, Series A. So all of our investments thus far have been seed and Series A.
Okay.
So...
And the idea is to get those companies, this company to sell to big ag. So those must be big contracts.
To license those
those
fungal microbe candidates. Yeah.
Okay. And then they just produce it massive volumes of liquid or whatever that has the fungal microbes in them.
Probably more appropriately a sort of a dried powder or medium through which, and then you put that in an IBC tank full of water, and then you spray it on your crop.
So what I'm trying to get at here is the business model of a company like that is incredibly exciting. It's a very clean sales channel in that it's only selling to so many of the big ag players, and they've got very strong relationships there.
How many are there?
Well, it depends where you are and what type of crop.
Right.
But there are only a small handful in each section, if you like. So they've been very clever around how they built their board and their advisors and their business development team, and they already have relationships, and they already have non-exclusive commercial relationships with all of the players that they need, at least within this first period, to license their first products.
Non-exclusive because the big ag companies might want to have exclusivity.
Which we wouldn't deem to be a hugely fair process. Sure. So yes.
Okay.
And then through to companies like No Fence, who are doing virtual fencing, which allows you to amp graze, as we were talking about earlier, but essentially move your livestock across a landscape in a way that is optimal for soil growth over a period of time without the onerous task of having to bang in fence posts on a daily basis. Right. And we've had farmers explain, to No Fence, but about how they've actually been able to take their wife on a date for the first time in 10 years. Because
so how does that No Fence technology work?
So GPS-enabled Pavlovian response to an audible cue. Okay. So imagine you're wearing the collar, and if you move towards the virtual fence, which is GPS-enabled, you'll hear an audible cue going beep, 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 beep. And if you keep going, the sound will get louder, and eventually you'll get a zap.
A zap. So the animals wear some kind of collar or something.
Yes.
Which is then gives a zap. Then they're like, okay, every time it goes beep, 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 I'm going to get a zap. So walk away. So
they train to it. So they now have large data sets on this. So first of all, the electric shock is half that of a traditional fence. So that's important to state. And the second thing is all of the data is showing that cattle, sheep and goats get trained to this system very quickly, and it's only a small percentage of the herd that actually get shocks. Right. And that small percentage of the herd are actually the inquisitive animals that are trying to graze the grass at the edge of the fence line. And they often put on the most weight, and they're the sort of the most, let's say, the most independent
risk takers
of the group.
I want to get that grass.
So in fact, the animal welfare data on that system looks like it's superior to a lot of other.
So I guess once they're trained on it, so it's like if you give them a few zaps, then they just generally, apart from this 2% adventurous type,
they respect the fence.
Yeah, they respect it. And then you can just like on some iPad be like, right, animals move over there, and then the virtual fence would move.
It'll even draw a corridor for you.
And then you just start seeing the animals move by the beeping they're hearing.
So let's say you've got a field. Some farms around the UK are non-contiguous, i.e. their farmland is separated, let's say, by a village, and they have to move their cows, with huge disruption across a bridge, let's say, or across a road, with the logistical nightmare that people have been managing for hundreds of years. With No Fence, you can actually create a corridor, and the animals will respect the corridor and move through it onto the new paddock that you've set for them.
I'd love to see that on a time lapse of just how it all works, them moving.
Yeah, and then the old fence line will then fold in behind them. It's very cool.
Right.
Or if you just don't particularly enjoy your neighbour's garden, and you lead a flock of sheep in at 4:00 in the morning, and then have them out again by 4:30, having decimated your poor neighbour's garden.
Right.
but in all seriousness, it has multiple. It's opening up innovation in agroecology that was very difficult beforehand. So an example of that will be grazing through woodlands and forests, which is actually really important to do in the Mediterranean right now in order to reduce the risk of forest fires. Right. Because the animals will eat the grass, which is like a tinder in summertime. They will eat that grass and kickstart the soil biological process, improve water infiltration, essentially reduce the the brash and the amount of tinder that's available in that forest that would set off and trigger a forest fire. But grazing through woodland is incredibly difficult to manage, logistically speaking. But with no fence, it becomes a breeze.
And that must save the farm. I mean, that's like a huge increase in efficiency from day one. Well, once the animals are trained on it, I assume, because now the ones that don't have that, they must be physically like herding for hours a day, or plus the fences, or they're putting down fences, putting them back up.
Well, you can imagine. I mean, you can see it when you're traveling on a train and you're going through any sort of, let's say, agricultural landscape. Is that the fencing and the hedges essentially dictate the environment within which the farmer farms the land. Longer term, no fence is opening up a situation where livestock farmers don't need to have these physical barriers in the landscape. Right. At the most, one extreme use of no fence is in conservation grazing. So actually some of the biggest clients of no fence in the UK at the moment are the big wildlife charities and the National Trust, who are actually using this to manage animals in huge landscapes which are of cultural and ecological significance. And they can now do things that they weren't able to do beforehand. So they can avoid certain areas that had ground nesting birds, and they don't have to be continually out in the landscape micromanaging the herd because the fence is controlled.
And they have to charge the collars or whatever they're using, because that's
you do have to charge the collars periodically. So you get replacement ones which you can charge up with battery packs, but they're also solar panels.
Oh, right.
They last for hours.
Okay, so
they last for a long, long time.
So you could leave them even in landscape that's not even got that much human involvement if you wanted to, because from what I understand about grazing cattle, it contributes to the soil. If you have animals there, they poo on those parts of the land, that contributes to the soil health as well. Is that why you're sending them out grazing?
Yeah, I mean, it's again, like lots of things, it's complicated and it's nuanced. And we should be transparent that a lot of livestock farming, even extensive farming where they're only eating grass, a lot of that land is degraded and the grass is overgrazed.
As a result of them? As
a function of poor management. It's not the animal's fault. It's the fact that the management of those animals hasn't led to improvements in soil health. It's these strategies that Chris was talking about in terms of amp grazing, rotational forms of grazing, essentially mimicking the natural predator-prey relationship, which is what triggers this ecological healing. And critically, that's where animals are constantly on the move. They're bunched and herded rather than spread out across the land. And every blade of grass has a significant recovery period. It's a bit like exercise. You don't go to the gym for 7 or 8 hours a day and expect and then have a tiny meal and a short sleep and expect great results.
Right.
It's the same thing with the land. Is the land needs to have that stimulus, it needs to have that exercise.
Which is the grazing.
So
by cutting the grass, that stimulates more growth in it.
A grassland's evolved with ruminants.
Yeah.
They are one and the same. So a grass, I've mentioned overgrazing as a common dimension of degenerative modern agriculture, but another one is understocking. Right. So if you have a landscape which is a grassland landscape or has that ecology within it, historically had grass there, if you remove all of the animals from that landscape, the grass goes brittle, it oxidizes, it goes black because essentially rather than decomposing in the soil, it's oxidizing and the carbon's going back up into the atmosphere, and the grass will eventually die back.
Right. So you need it. So the ideal system is, once again, looking at a whole ecosystem again, it seems like, to have animals mixed with planting of crops. I mean, or can you, because I've seen other permaculture systems where they have pigs, they let them in certain areas, or chickens, they'll go through certain areas, they'll release them, or ducks even. I think they do that quite a lot in Indonesia as well, where you see they kind of release them into one area to get all the insects out. So that obviously feeds the ducks and they eat those as well, but they would also use them as a part, instead of say using insecticides, send the ducks in, they'll go and eat everything. And the same with even other types of insects. Sometimes you can use ecological solutions to keep certain pests in balance within the ecosystem. So it's not just the concept of kill everything except the thing we want to grow. It's manage a whole ecosystem of various species interacting in healthy ways, which goes from larger species like chickens or ducks down to the micro organisms in the soil, and which also reflects back into our bodies, which our bodies are ecosystems as well, of like whole microbiome in our guts and all that. And it seems to me, it always seems to be coming back to realize everything's an ecosystem, realize we're an ecosystem, the agricultural system should be an ecosystem too. But that obviously involves a lot more understanding of various processes happening and interacting. It's not as simple as put input in, get something out. Put these ingredients in. You need to be monitoring lots of different things. And I think with data collection, and again, AI would be able to show the results of different combinations of species or systems interacting with one another to give various results, which would then inform what you do on the next round, etc.
Yeah, no, you're quite right. I mean, this is one of the themes that Chris and I talk about, is this, if farming is complex enough as it is, but as you've described, industrial agriculture tries to make things as basic and as plug and play and as monoculture as possible. What you're alluding to with permaculture is I think, is the principle of diversity and stacking different enterprises on top of one another. That's definitely true of regenerative farming. That's a pattern, and it implies that the shift is one towards a more knowledge management intensive industry that requires adaptive, shifting decision making.
Yeah.
And so data is a huge component of this, and many of our investments are going to be leveraging data.
Sure. Okay. Like what other data? So you're looking at the data of soil?
Well, for example, soil carbon.
Right.
So Chris was talking about the climate community, the climate investment community. The climate investment community has a sort of the same thesis, which is the net zero thesis, is that if we can reduce industrial emissions to practically zero by 2050, we will escape the worst heating effects of global warming. There's an additional scientific thesis which points out that even if we were to be successful at reducing all of those emissions, the CO2 that has become acidified in our oceans over the last 100 years will re-equilibrate with the atmosphere. Right. Because, principles of osmosis, you create a vacuum, the CO2 will fill that vacuum. So in our world, in our climate thesis, carbon drawdown, so drawing down as much CO2 as possible into natural ecosystems, into the oceans and into the soils in our land and into trees, is absolutely mission critical.
Right.
And it's by drawing down the carbon and rebuilding our soils that we get these other massive co-benefits. By repairing the water cycle, we're essentially rebuilding the planet's natural ability to cool itself, these refrigeration effects, which allow us to balance out incident solar radiation.
I see. And what's an example of a company that's helping do those kind of things?
I can't say the name of the specific company that we're about to invest into,
right.
But I can say that the founders cut their teeth as high-level mathematicians working with very large environmental data sets.
Okay.
So they pioneered research in establishing where, for example, Ebola outbreaks would occur in Africa by crunching large amounts of environmental data, and they're applying that same thinking to how we measure the world's soils.
I see. Interesting. And how many companies are you guys looking at before you filter down to the ones that make it into the portfolio?
I think we've got 700 in our pipe at the moment.
Wow. Yeah, it grows pretty quickly.
14 billion sterling in terms of that 700's next round requirements for funding.
Wow.
So the opportunity for fund managers in this space and the reason that we are hopefully being the opposite of proprietary and protectionist. We want to be as inclusive as possible in terms of encouraging more fund managers into this space as possible. The opportunity for many of us to exist, I say many, I mean, there could be 20, 30, 40 funds at 50 to 100 million looking at this space. And I still don't think there'd be a saturation point.
And these are all startups.
So we say startups. So we invest pre-seed Series A, which for those that I don't know how well your audience know this space, but a pre-seed company is pre-revenue. It's an idea. It might be a very small team. A late Series A company could be doing double-digit million revenue, hopefully on some kind of on a margin that makes sense, raising upwards of between 20 and 40 million for that particular round. So it's a pretty large swathe. And the amount of companies that we see that are operating within a very specific sector or section of that farm to fork value chain that are already offering a more viable, a more economically useful for the whether it's the farmer or the corporate or the entity that is transitioning, as well as producing a better product, exists to a point where we feel incredibly privileged to be able to sit as one of the, I'm hesitant to use the word pioneering venture firms in this space, but we're one of a very small handful.
I would say that.
So, and the opportunities really do abound. And I suppose one of the pieces that makes it more exciting for us than potentially going into a very saturated space in terms of investor is the fact that because across this farm to fork value chain, so much of the science is nascent, whether this is understanding of the soil or hydrology, latent cooling systems, or how we bioassimilate food, or how we get consumers to shift their consumption patterns quickly. It's produced this enormous dirge of companies, as I say, but also the either the experts or the researchers or the vocal components of those. So the people that are either hosting the radio shows or writing the books, or Dr. Chris getting his shows on TV, or the supermarkets that are leading the space. Like, I mean, I've used Waitrose as an example. Because we're the first fund into this space, we get to have access to a lot of these, I mean, we call them our heroes, but a lot of these drivers. And that not only allows us to have fairly cutting edge, as modestly as I'd say it, access to best information, but it also allows us access to an incredibly or disproportionately active network. And if our team is only ever going to consist of a very small handful of us, because we believe in full accountability, essentially, and having to know our companies that we're investing in or preparing to invest in incredibly well, then it allows us to be a small team who technically are low touch. You have venture firms that would have many people working with each portfolio company post-investment to make sure that they are hitting their KPIs and they are progressing in a way that is optimal for the investor. We obviously can't afford to do that. So we are by definition low touch investors, but because we have such a disproportionately active network, whether that's the big farming groups in the UK, whether it's DEFRA, whether it's the ministers, whether it's any of the big food corporates that operate within the UK, whether it's any of the largest investors globally looking at this space, whether it's West Coast Silicon Valleyites, many of whom bring a level of experience and technical knowledge that is, very differentiated to what we might have in the UK, or whether it's universities here, we're able to bring those parties together and really forge progress. And that, I suppose, is what's so exciting about where we are, and really, I think, creates a duty for Simon and I, who are now fairly long in the tooth of this, to actually really get moving.
Sure.
One of our visions, and this sort of, I think, touches on some of the business models and some of the strategy around what we're doing at Pelican AG, is there's an emerging asset class, very early stage emerging asset class, particularly in Europe, and it's called natural capital. So there are various reasons why this is all going on. I'll give you an example. large corporates have signed up in the UK and Europe to two regimes. One's called TNFD, Task Force for Nature Financial Disclosures, and CSRD, which is the equivalent in the EU. But this is the first time in the world where large companies are volunteering to disclose their exposure to biodiversity loss and habitat destruction. So this is, in a sense, an extension of climate policy, whereby governments around the world are recognizing, and this has all come through the COPs really over the last sort of 15 or so years, but there's a growing recognition that our economies need to shift away from what we've been doing towards a more nature positive future. And that, in a sense, has started with disclosures around emissions and attempts to reduce emissions at various levels, Scope 1, Scope 2, and Scope 3, which you can touch on if people want to. And now is entering the world of biodiversity. So where is the biodiversity loss occurring? How can we stop it or reduce it? How do we change our businesses to adapt to a changing climate? And how can we restore biodiversity? And that's where natural capital comes in. So large institutional investors are beginning to raise funds and write significant checks into a range of entrepreneurs and businesses and NGOs that are looking to rebuild habitats at scale around the world. And within that, regenerative farming is one of the key areas of deployment. So Chris and I are very much at the vanguard of where a lot of capital is going to be deployed into the farming community, but other land stewards, in order to rebuild the soil, rebuild habitats, plant trees, introduce these various repair watercourses, for example. But that's only going to happen in exchange for hard ecological data that improvements have taken place.
Right.
So the very same technologies that we think can be functional and helpful to the farming and the food community to establish what regenerative farming is from a sort of a continuous improvement perspective are the same layers of technology that institutional investors are going to require in order to make these exchanges of value. Money going to land stewards for nature-based solutions in exchange for proof that ecological impact has taken place.
Maybe this is quite a good segue into the institutional investor. They are the difference between meaningful funding and not. And this space that I suppose might have been considered fairly cottage a few years ago is now very much on the map. So we're an emerging fund manager, an emerging venture fund manager. We're raising 75 million, which is very small for those that don't know the space. And it would have been incredibly rare for an institution to have got excited or even considered an emerging manager in a niche sector 10 years ago, 5 years ago. We're now being backed and in the process of being backed, i.e. very far through quite extensive due diligence with a range of investors whom have alighted within their climate thesis on soil building, nature restoration, regenerative farming, healthy food as a solution to the health crisis, the restoration of climate as the key area to focus on. Now, the options within this is they can get involved in a real asset fund that buys land to reforest or to farm regeneratively. And there are some great players around the world whom we know very well in America, in Australia, some of whom have raised as much as 750 million into their last products and might be working from almonds in California to prunes in Portugal. So it's real asset investment, which is owning the land or having some kind of lease relationship with the landowner within these products, or it's getting into the private markets. Now, within the private markets, the UK has never been as sophisticated as America in terms of the amount of a portfolio, the percentage of a portfolio that would go into PE and venture. And what does go into the venture portfolio tends to be through the 5 large venture firms in the UK. So what we're seeing is these institutions realize that there simply aren't focused investors within the nature, food and farming restoration space that we can back. And if we want this ecosystem to develop, we've got to go early stage, because in 5 years' time, these Series A companies will be on potentially their Series C, or potentially IPOing. And the pre-seed companies will be at Series B. So we need to invest here for the development of the sector, but also because there's a first mover advantage. So we're suddenly seeing super large British institutions where the needle of investing £5 million into a 75 million fund, even if it does incredibly well, is not significant enough to move their needle at all.
Yeah.
However, realize the importance of being involved in the space and wanting to develop it. So we're being looked at extraordinarily by the range of banks, wealth managers, pension funds, large corporates, and not just corporates within food and farming, but corporates who are perhaps one tier less related to the space.
Right. As investors into your fund.
Into the fund.
Right, which they would, yeah, because it does seem, from my experience, a lot of institutional investors they kind of shy away from the really early stage stuff, especially pension funds, things like that. They'd want to wait till you're more established. But there does also seem to be massive funds out there available with the aim of, even through the World Bank or the UN, there's huge amount of green bonds being issued and things like that. And I mean, some of the numbers are like enormous, like in the multi-billions. And so it seems like there is a desire to do something and funds being raised successfully for it. But I wonder how much is making it down to the early stage guys, like what you guys are focusing on.
That's our crusade, literally,
That's
to
your
summarize
crusade.
it. Yeah, and it's one that it usually just involves explanation. And we've sat down with very large asset managers who are very much focused on real assets and explaining the need to at least put a percentage of their portfolio into this space. Once we've explained, the penny does seem to really drop, if it hasn't already. You know, we don't want to sound like we're patronizing these people. It feels like there will be more of an influx of institutional funds in an extraordinary fashion into this particular sector, because it needs to be driven into maturity. And that's really exciting for us. It also is a way of engaging these larger institutions, because the stories are often so impressive at a venture level, whether you're restoring a particular area, or whether you're as our last investment, which is a platform. I say our last investment, the company we're looking at, which is a nutritional analysis platform that really does provide the raw data that leads every road back to regeneration.
Right.
It's a story that's very exciting for more institutional investors to begin to get on board with and sit with us for a number of years and our companies, and actually watch the whole space mature over the various different stages.
I mean, if I may, those institutional investors that were pioneers in impact investing and ESG mandates, they've gone long on renewable energy infrastructure and affordable housing, and to a certain degree, depending on which if they're investing in developing countries, they've also gone long into education. But I think it's a logical. I think they've told us quite explicitly that their logical next step is to invest in food and farming and nature as critical infrastructure. Because if you've established a thesis around addressing social and environmental issues within the economy, all roads, as we've described endlessly, lead back to the land and how we're managing it. So I agree with you. Yes, they are cautious and they never like backing things that are thoroughly immature.
Yeah.
But by the same token, we're living in extraordinary times. And so I think the market signals are very, very clear. Capital is already being allocated to emerging managers such as ourselves.
And almost, I mean, in that sense, it means that our job is fairly simple in terms of sitting down with these LPs. It's proving that the market exists, which we can do very easily through referencing the range of companies we're seeing. It's then proving that there's enough companies that have the return profiles that a standard investor is going to want, i.e. it's not sacrificing anything versus standard venture.
Sure.
And obviously what we try and do is show how it exceeds usual market dynamics. A third piece that plays into our hands is almost everyone we meet has had someone who has either been affected, who either owns land or has seen land being degraded that they care about, or has a family member who has been in some way negatively affected by diet.
Sure. Oh, almost everyone. Yeah.
Almost everyone.
Almost everyone, I'm sure.
And as that comes into play, and this, the idea that, if the American public realised that each year on an annual basis, more Americans die from diet-related ill health than from every single American war combined on an annual basis, people would be in uproar.
Yeah.
And this is coming more and more to the fore. So I suppose the point is the tailwinds for showing investors not only why from a moral obligation perspective and a planetary perspective, but from a return profile perspective, how important this is becoming something that we don't really need to touch anymore.
And at the political level, it's very difficult to see a future where the Western economies are spending more on their healthcare systems than they are now. Right. There's already a lot of resistance in the population, although we've voted in a Labour government and we've kicked out I think an incredibly useless, busted flush of a Tory government. You can see that there's a huge amount of resistance in society to pay more taxation into public services, which we're so incredibly dependent on. In a sense, there is a subconscious awareness that we've built a beast of burden, and we only get a more efficient and cheaper healthcare service by becoming healthier as a nation.
Yeah.
And that joined up thinking that we've sat on panels advising government bills on glyphosate usage or bio-input usage, because bio-inputs are still looked at by the chemical department as opposed to DEFRA, for instance. But the point is, this joined up thinking in government is being petitioned for by various think tanks, the Food and Farming Commission being a good one, who've recently, I think last week, released their true cost of British food, which essentially says that we spend more on healthcare as a result of diet-related ill health than we do on the food system itself. Wow. And I think the figure was 56 billion that could be spent on preventative food education or food as medicine that would then prevent I think it's something like 270 that's spent on the healthcare side.
I guess the challenge is to get consensus of what is healthy. I mean, some are pretty obvious, some things are pretty obvious, move away from the highly processed, more towards whole foods. But even inside that, is there consensus on what is a healthy diet? You go to hospitals, you see what kind of food they serve there. It's almost like they don't know what's healthy.
You've just been told that you're diabetic, and you end up with a jelly on your plate and some tinned cream.
We've all been lied to, and in a sense, it's no one's fault. We're not going to make progress by shaming each other or pointing fingers. But I think an acceptance that whole foods are superior to ultra-processed foods is not staggeringly controversial, although it is going to trigger a lot of people, particularly because there's a lot of people who can't afford whole foods.
Right.
So it creates a class divide that there's a risk of that becoming.
Because what is it? Is it 3% of food is organic in the UK or something like that?
Pretty small.
So that's pretty small. So that means 97% is chemical laden, etc. So I always find it, and the premium of organic to non-organic food is like I'm paying to not have chemicals on my food, and people can't afford to not pay that premium. That is crazy. But if all the farmers moved into that space, I assume that would bring the cost down and make it more affordable for everyone.
As Chris has mentioned, we're already at the beginning of a massive sea change, the biggest sea change in agricultural policy in 70 years. So the ELMS program that Chris has alluded to, which is a break from the Common Agricultural Policy, it's far from a perfect set of policies. There's lots of issues with it. But the general direction of travel is from paying farmers to produce as much food as they possibly can, which was the post-war farming social contract, towards essentially public goods with nature and healthy soil and biodiversity being central to that, alongside food production. So that's huge over the long term, because at the moment, what we see in the supermarket is essentially a system that we subsidize through our taxation.
Sure. Like what most food being produced is subsidized in some way, like milk. I know dairy is
No, not really.
not really dairy.
No.
What sections?
The things that are subsidized are the most ultra-processed foods,
Really?
globally speaking, yeah.
Subsidize how they subsidize the producers?
We're paying farmers to essentially produce the most amount of food in the easiest way possible for the largest buyers.
I see.
Which is why, the negatives at the moment around what's happened with inheritance tax and farming generally, the subsidies that are on the table at the moment are about 3.5 billion a year. I think we've agreed 22.5 billion to go to direct air carbon capture this year, which I think is 4,000 jobs, which is, in our world is a fairly depressing thing to hear, because we see soil obviously as being the great direct air carbon capture piece, and not a bit of machinery that isn't necessarily proven. But we're
a lot more expensive.
And a lot more expensive, and it's sort of farcical and a bit tragic, and I hope that the money doesn't end up getting spent, and there's a lot of pushback, so hopefully we will not see it being spent. But the only thing that if you were to try and take positives around where we are now in the UK, you've got obviously the Common Agricultural Policy being phased out and ELMS being phased in. By no means perfect, but it will improve. We're seeing a generational handover. So the average age of a farmer is, depending on who you ask, somewhere between 56 and 64. And we're seeing a proliferation of different markets appear, different brands appear, different ways of communicating from farm to farm, more acceptance around shifting farm practice, and crucially, big farm, big ag, big food, all getting on the bandwagon to varying degrees for transitioning a food system. So there is going to be monumental, significant change, and it's only going to accelerate, whilst the world is also legislating, and whilst from a visceral human perspective, we witness more and more extreme weather events and begin to understand the issues going on with our health. So however painful it is, all of that is going to forge this change, which is the underlying basis for why we're doing this. And it's very easy, the human condition finds it very easy to focus on a negative and to let it become the mainstay of how one thinks. And there's a use in that. It's a survival piece, but it's not. It's actually very lazy often, because the harder thing to do is to imagine what the opposite, what the positive could bring. And the great thing about the UK in terms of technology, in terms of innovation, is that we've always led in Europe. We've always fostered an incredible dynamic within our university system, within even funding systems, to make sure that there is room to fund and to get involved with creation of innovation. And from the experience that Simon and I have of interviewing many early stage, young, bright-eyed and bushy-tailed people, often, I say young, often they're people who have perhaps been in academia for 40 years, but who are new to the game as entrepreneurs often. The experience that we have in interviewing these people is quite, I suppose, is on a very basic level, is totally humbling. We are forever having our perceptions pushed and whatever we thought was usually totally one thing, or we had an opinion either way, it's very frequently turned on its head. And the UK has a very real chance, provided funding is encouraged into this space at a greater rate, of really leading within Europe and even exporting, whether it's our codes and certifications or whether it's our methodologies, to the rest of the world.
Yeah, I mean, just to second what Chris has said, I forget who made this sort of pithy observation, but in an area that's poised for rapid innovation, the first observation is the talent pool increasing, and then the capital is always a lag to that. And if you were to spend a week or a month or 6 months in Chris and I's shoes, you'd see that there's such a deep bench. The talent pool is really impressive in our space,
Right.
and that's the biggest visceral signal. That's the biggest, I think, data point that our space has significant momentum.
So the soft quality that goes with the talent pool increasing, that I don't think is spoken about enough, but is probably part of the reason that we're here. You know, you've spent time studying permaculture. You know, we met at a Regenerative Food Systems conference,
Yeah.
and your knowledge was fairly unique, and we had this bond around where we thought that the world could move to, and you had some experience in Brazil, and we're obviously here, and it was common ground. But what I'm alluding to is, because everyone eats and everyone experiences nature at some point, and everyone understands either health or ill health and climate, there is this visceral glue, and it's something that I think investors have probably been wary of talking about with LPs, because it sounds ethereal and sort of unquantifiable and a bit probably namby-pamby. The reality of it is that if you're talking sense and you have a clear message or a clear aim or a clear way you can help, it creates an accelerated way of working together that is incredibly useful when building a company or investing into a company. So it means that other investors, for instance, in this space, will send us a company and say, we really want you to look at this, and we really want you to join the round, even if the round's closed, because we think you're a focused investor who would be able to add disproportionate value to the company over the long run. Or it might be, we are working with a team of farmers or landowners, and we particularly want to pilot this product, and we would like to market it. Or so there's a lot of proactive involvement that accelerates the whole process because people are so wedded to it emotionally.
So through your network of almost the good guys, I would say, in terms of you can put them all together and help link up via your portfolio companies and through your contacts in, whether it's even in the government. Are you speaking to people in government as well? Yeah, all that. You can actually add quite a lot of value as opposed to just a pure investment play.
Yeah, it's the joy of what we do, is that you can really help companies to problem solve.
And you've worked with BlackRock previously. I mean, how do you feel about the change into this space? I mean, when you're still doing the same thing, fundraising, how does that feel different?
I mean, I suppose that was a long time ago, but I mean, I got into this space because I got a bad gut, and I went to see 8 gastroenterologists over the period of about 5 years, and none of them asked me about how I was living my life. There was very little direction around what I should be eating. You know, in their eyes, dairy, wheats, ultra-processed food, there was not enough data to say that it was necessarily bad for me. And
in fact, it's even recommended, isn't it, by the government to eat as part of the food pyramid they recommend, right?
Yeah. It's quite a funny South Park episode when Eric Cartman discovers that if they put the food pyramid upside down, it will solve America's obesity problem.
Right.
And whether or not, I can't remember what the American food pyramid looks like, but there's definitely some sense there. But I suppose I was diagnosed with ulcerative colitis, which is a sliding scale towards Crohn's. It's chronic, and it's in the British medical community, at least 8 years ago, there was no way of stopping that evolution. And I went down the rabbit hole of trying to work out how to solve and cure this. It became very clear that a lot of Eastern medicine has been curing essentially polyps in your ileum, which is the final chamber of your large intestine before it goes into your small intestine, for centuries, via what you eat, by the provenance of the food you eat. Essentially, how healthy is the food that you're eating? What was the health of the soil that food came from? And trying to obviously cut out as much sugar as possible, and trying to, around all of that, holistically make sure that you were satiating yourself with healthy relationships, exercising. You know, I'm sort of fairly fanatic. I need to do a lot of exercise, and you know, fulfilling your life in terms of other joys. And it became very clear that this was where I wanted to dedicate my time. I'd been in a Asian and Japanese hedge fund for 9 years. I'd invested in a few early stage companies, PA, and so I decided to set up an advisory firm that would look at sustainable food and farming, early stage, and try and work out whether we could, set up a team that could look at investing proprietarily into the space, whether the market was big enough, whether we could get access to the leading companies, whether we could add value significantly to those, and whether we could get to know the leading investors in the space globally. And that became very, very positive very, very quickly. Timing was fortuitous. And so Simon and I were introduced by about 8 different people within about 6 months of starting that. And you know, my wife thought I was having an affair because I come home late, having spent an hour and a half on the phone to this one. And we had matching, very complementary skill sets. And yeah.
Because your background was already impact investing, so you were already in the space, right?
Yeah.
You joined in.
15 years in early stage impact investing.
Right. But that was more genuine. Then you decide to focus on the food system together.
Yeah, but you know, as Chris has described, very personal. It's also deeply personal to me. I grew up with biodynamic, organic horticulture as my family's passion and obsession. So I've been growing vegetables and fruits and turning compost since I was 4 years old. Right. So, you know, I entered the world as an adult and I was sort of amazed at what was sort of going. I'd never liked the food system. Right. And also within impact investing, where I did a lot of work around renewable energy and battery storage technologies in the early days, and affordable housing and sustainable products, alternatives to plastics. You know, you name it. I've done some work on one of the SDGs, or worked with some pretty interesting startups and investors. But generally speaking, investors have been sort of illiterate or tone deaf when it comes to ecology and nature. And when I got out of that world, you know, I was looking for a soul that was traveling in a similar direction. And you know, Chris and I share that passion of, you know, putting a positive vision of the future state of our natural world and humanity within it as the North Star.
Perfect. I think that's a good note to end on. I think I commend you too for your mission, and I support you fully. And thanks for joining me here today and sharing your vast fountain of knowledge with the listeners.
Thanks, Darius.
Really appreciate it, Darius. Thanks a lot.